Hello and welcome to Leveling Towards an Ungendered World, the second day of a very insightful, experiential and engaging sessions that are coming up. I hope you've had the opportunity and the occasion to join us yesterday and partake in some of the many discussions that we've had, including the Socratic dialogues that we have today as well. So quick heads up on what's coming up today. So first up, we've got the introduction to the talk by Faye D'Souza, the founder and editor of Free Media Interactive, and I'm going to introduce her in a little bit. After which, at 10:45, we have our plenary session 3, that's on efficiency, making meritocracy work for women. The three participants are Anu Meena, founder of Agrowave Gurgaon Rural, Vinati Kastia Kilambi, senior partner at law firm AZB Partners, and Suparna Singh, CEO of NDTV. So that's the plenary session, which will start at 10:45 and go on till 11:45. And later in the evening, we have our seminar dialogues based on the Socratic method, like we did yesterday. That's at 3 o'clock. We also have another Ananta talk by Sairi Chahal, the founder of Shiro's, at 5 p.m. And then finally, a plenary session on community building your tribe at 5:15 p.m. And that's the last session for the day. So it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Faye D'Souza, founder and editor of Free Media Interactive Private Limited, and also a former dear colleague of mine from my days in CNBC TV 18. Faye is an award-winning journalist and now entrepreneur. She's worked for about 16 years. She's launched and led a national television news channel with over 100 employees and is considered one of the most popular news personalities in the country. She now uses a social media following, which has over 2 million people across platforms, to inform, educate, and engage with India's youth. She began her career at CNBC TV 18. She's also subsequently worked with ET Now, and also then became the founding editor of Mirror Now, a channel that served the needs of Indian citizens by taking up issues that were core to the quality of life of the average Indian. And as executive editor of Mirror Now, she was responsible for the editorial direction, grooming young reporters, the profit and loss accounts, and the success of the channel in popularity and ratings. And now is all set to launch something called Beetroot, which will be a new brand of news that will deliver news to young and urban citizens of India with dignity and without outrage, opinion, and activism, something that we sorely and surely need. Today, she's going to talk about making meritocracy work for women, facing women who face implicit and explicit biases in because of their genres, because of their backgrounds. What would it take for them to choose a vocation or live their lives without being compromised or compromising or being subjected to less than equal rights? So that's the theme for Faye's talk that's coming up now, and it's over to you, Faye, and welcome once again to all of you for joining in on the second day of the Leveling, and it's over to you, Faye.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Ananta Center for inviting me. There is an extremely illustrious lineup of speakers at this event, so it's an honor to be included among these speakers. For those of you who are wondering who I am, and that's a valid thing to wonder. My name is Faye D'Souza. I'm a journalist. I spent 16 years in television journalism. You can roll your eyes at me. And over the last year or so, I've switched to being an independent journalist on the internet, using the internet and social media to communicate news to young people in India. I founded a company called Free Media Interactive. Free as in a bird, free, not free as in something you don't pay for. The idea is to create a space where independent, honest journalism still has room, and that's the aim. So that's where I am right now. I've been asked to speak on the topic of making meritocracy work for women. And my first sort of reaction to this, to the topic was, wow, do we still have to talk about this now in the year 2021? Are we still talking about how to create a meritocracy for women in workplaces? And I found that, kind of shocking. But if you actually sit back and take a look at where we are coming out of the pandemic year, there couldn't have been a better time to have this conversation. And there's a lot of data we can refer to. A lot of that data, incidentally, is from India Spend. We'll have the good fortune of listening to Govindraj Etraj speak in a little while. He's the founder of India Spend. So I'm going to give you broad strokes of what I'm talking about. Women were worse off, worse hit by the pandemic than men in almost every angle of life, right? And I'll come to what's happening in the workspace, but first I just want to, put this into perspective. The UN put out a research piece that said that the free birth control that primary healthcare centers distribute during the lockdown didn't go out. So there were about 20 million families in India who would have otherwise used birth control from the government who didn't have access to birth control, and there's likely to be a spike in the number of unwanted or unplanned for babies in our country, a massive, and India will lead in that spike. And what this actually means, is that women will be perhaps forced into more unsafe abortions. Baby girls will be abandoned. It's also likely that older girls will be pulled out of school in order to look after the younger girls. Coming to school, for so many girls in our country, the midday meal is their only source of nutrition, which didn't happen during the lockdown. All school teaching went online, and while India has a great penetration of smartphones, data shows us that the smartphones belong to the men, and so it is father, older brother, mother, and then school-going girl who has access to that smartphone. So it's likely that education completely failed for lakhs and lakhs of little girls across the country who just simply couldn't study because they didn't have access to internet or to smartphones. In the workspace, I'm referring to data, and I'm referring to an article that I read on India Spend. It basically said that women lost more jobs than men as a percentage of those working, and also found it more difficult to regain those jobs. And that should actually, make us wonder why, right? And we've heard anecdotally people say, sort of off the record, that when time comes for cost cutting in all our offices, there are two things that come into play. Women tend to be considered more for layoffs than men because the woman's salary is considered the second salary in the house. And so you're not exactly making an entire family destitute, but you would be putting everybody under pressure if a man lost his job. And secondly, women are considered to be less serious about their jobs because they have commitments at home. And as much as we might think we are past this, the truth is we're not. And then, of course, there are all of those things that play in, employment that is perhaps, not formal employment, but the informal employment has its different considerations. But I'm talking about formal employment and salaried professionals. We've all heard this being said in our workplaces, sort of whispered behind backs, right? So I took a look at some of the data of what things are like in a pandemic year and outside of a pandemic year as well. So girls have been outperforming boys in the 10th and the 12th standard for about 7 years straight. So they've done better than the boys across the board. And we've seen this in every newspaper, right? So 10th standard exams results announced, girls outperform boys. It's almost a normal thing. So they're doing better at high school. When they go to higher education, we've seen a sharp increase in the number of girls who enroll for higher education. That number has gone up from 39% to 46% between 2007 and 2014. But over the same period of time, female participation in India's labor force has come down sharply. And in 2014, our participation of women in the labor force was 27%. It was down from 34% than it was earlier. So on one hand, you have more girls doing better in high school, actually going to college, but fewer women in the workspace and fewer women lasting in the workspace. Again, this is from India Spend. It says women's workforce participation in India is the lowest among BRICS nations, and it's in the range of countries like Bahrain, Malaysia, and even Somalia that does better than us. So what's going on? And why is it that if we have meritocracies, why is it that women aren't able to sort of to stick out their careers to the end? And if we look at the numbers of management in our country, we know that there are women joining the workforce to some extent, but somehow they tend to drop out. So what is going on? And does that have to do with the meritocracy? The reasons given in most research for the reasons why women drop out of the workforce are family pressure and looking after children. That actually made me ask this question. What is merit when we talk about women in the workplace? How do you measure merit? So on one hand, you have a woman who has a child who needs to be picked up from school, PTA meetings that have to be, attended, homework that needs to be attended to, dabbas that need to be made in the morning before the child goes to school, housework that needs to be, at least instructions need to be given, plus the job she does at work. And she's competing with a man who has the job he does at work. Is that a meritocracy? And is there somewhere that we're missing out on that? And just to, and I'm drawing right now from personal sort of things that I've heard when I was, in a large company. And as a journalist working for a very popular news network, I was told some very interesting things. First of all, I was told that men have more credibility when it comes to news, simply from merit of being men. And so women are considered less credible as journalists. And so I was advised to hire a man to sit next to me during my news programs, to make the news program more credible simply by his presence. I mean, is that an unconscious bias or a more conscious bias? Is definitely a bias, right? I was told that since you're a girl, you should be a little more like, tum ladki ho, tum matlab pyar se kaam chalao na, apna gussa kyun kar rahe ho? So, it's automatically assumed that women will be more grateful, more submissive, more maternal when they are in the workspace. There's less room for ambition. There's less room for aggression from women, whereas the same sort of behavior from a man is considered, go-getting in some ways. But the things that I found, the bias that I found obvious on the ground, and I'm sure if a lot of you think back, you would have realized that there is some bias perhaps in your workspaces as well, is that when a woman has a child at home, she's automatically written out of the competition. That, she's not going to be focused anymore. Her mind is going to be at home. She's going to want to, focus on her child. There's a bias against women who sort of pick up their bags and leave at a certain point of the day. So at exactly 6 o'clock or 6:30, they're like, boom, boom, listen, I have to go. And they're out the door and say, oh, okay, so she's always the first one out the door. But a lot of times people don't realize that women have a full-time job waiting for them at home when they finish work in the office. So unlike, sometimes men who can spend time drinking chai, discussing politics, going for a walk to the cigarette shop, coming back, and then sort of getting to work, women need to account for almost every minute of their day because there's constantly something going on. There's this whole idea that women cannot travel because home commitments. I was in a system where management meetings would be done either over drinks or at weekends at a farmhouse where women were not invited and only the men were invited. And we knew that there were decisions being made in these conversations, but we were not invited because nobody wanted to be made uncomfortable by the presence of women in that boys' club. So that brings us back to merit. Then is it fair at that point to actually then say, let's now compare these two individuals purely based on their performance on, purely on merit? I remember that I was being paid sharply lower than other men doing the exact same job that I was doing. How do you compare merit with someone who has so much more going on in their lives? And that we have seen from research happens specifically to women. Is it the job of the workplace to even that playing field, or can the workplace turn around and say, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about that? In that case, is that workplace sort of giving up on the idea of merit altogether? And research shows us that when there are children to look after, or there's an elderly parent to look after, the woman invariably is the one who quits her job because unequal salaries. Because the cost of care in India is so high. The cost of hiring someone to look after your child or hiring someone to look after an elderly parent is so high that invariably the decision that is made is, listen, let's forego your salary. Why don't you stay at home and get this done? And this will always be the decision for as long as women make lower salaries than men for the same job, because straight off the bat, you've lost that argument. And you said, okay, I make less money. And that's the truth. And that's just something that we've just not managed. That's hurdle we've not managed to get past. Oddly enough, India is the only country in the world where women take a gap from work because their child is in the 10th standard and they have to focus on getting this child to study. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, but again, it's always the woman who has to quit, and invariably coming back, like I said, becomes really, really difficult. And then, of course, there's this whole idea of PTA meetings that happen on Wednesdays at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which seems just like a conspiracy against the working woman. The most stark sort of lack of meritocracy was apparent during the lockdown, where the most accomplished women I know personally, who've been to Ivy League schools, who have great jobs in great organizations, who are waking up at the crack of dawn to do jaru, pocha, bartan, cooking, get everything done, put food on the table before the family wakes up so that she can get to work and work from home, because there was no help at that time. And it was almost like, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but most Indian men apparently believe that housework is done by little Disney-like birds that fly in through the window and get everything done. They were oblivious to what was happening in the house. The women were not only doing their own work from home, they were sitting behind the computer and sort of aiding the online teaching process for their children who were now learning at home. They were doing all of the housework, all of the cooking, figuring out where to source their groceries from in the middle of a lockdown. It was the sharpest realization of how unequal our spaces are than ever before. And so I just want to leave you with one idea of, when it comes to creating a meritocracy, I do not believe we can separate home from work. Because as much as we might want to say at work that we treat everybody equal, if we don't provide the women in workplaces with adequate childcare, if we don't provide them with assistance when they're looking after family members, if we don't provide them with the ability to work in flexi hours, to be able to juggle their responsibilities, we are actually not creating a meritocracy. So to say that, listen, I'm completely impartial and I treat all my employees the same, is actually a fallacy, because you have two people standing on two completely different platforms. And to say that, okay, now I want you to compete with each other and I'll judge you without any emotion, is actually unfair to the person standing on the lower platform. That's just my submission for today, that if we are, especially coming out of this very difficult year, if we are, and if we truly aim to create meritocracies for women, we have to consider what's happening at home as well. Because the other thing to do is to wait for society to evolve. And I don't know if we have that kind of time, because an evolving society takes far too long. And every piece of research that has ever been submitted has said the same thing to us, that when you have more women in the workplace, the company does better. When you have more women in management, when you have more women in investment teams, performance is always better. When you have more women in school, the social measures of a particular community improve. Educated women result in better GDP. Educated women who are working in the workforce result in lower birth rates, in an increased age of marriage, lower crime rates, all of these things. Educating, feeding our girls, empowering our women is the silver bullet that will save businesses, will save the country, will save our smaller communities. This is what we need to find out how to do. And I do hope that as working professionals and as entrepreneurs and business leaders, we will find ways to create more merit in our workspace for women. Thank you.